Good evening. Welcome to Poets Corner here at the Scarritt Bennett Center in Nashville, Tennessee. I am Donna Patterson, the Anakaram chaplain in residence, and am delighted to welcome all of you either virtually or in person, and delighted to have Jeff Hardin as our poet this evening. And I'm looking around and thinking that this is the poet of poets because most of you in the audience are other poets, and I'm grateful for you being here. Jeff is from Savannah, Tennessee, born and raised, and an eighth generation descendant of the county's founding member. He is a graduate of Austin P with his bachelor's in English and his master's from the University of Alabama with his MFA in poetry. He's the author of 4 chapbooks, and he has 2 new books coming out, Watermark and Strange Land, brand new one. If you want to know more about Jeff, you can go to his website, jeffhardin.weebly.com. He has been the recipient of several prizes, and I know that we are in for a treat tonight in having him. So please give a warm welcome to Jeff Hardin.
Well, thank you for all being here. It's good to see you. I'm going to start, as I typically do, I guess, by reading the poem I wrote at 5 o'clock this morning, while the rest of you were sleeping, I suppose. A poem is an abandonment of one thought after another. The thoughts I've had to abandon make another story whose themes rival Pompeii's demise and dig up daily new scrolls from the earth. How easy to forget that, poised between one moment and the next, I am really only a soul. Forgive this weeping through the last of my words. I keep losing Blake's grain of sand. Where is eternity now? A red bird flutters its wings against the window in joyful and thoughtful delight. Maybe only a few moments remain. Whether enough or too much, I leave to the sound of a church bell heard once down a mountain's valley. It's good. I've been left alone all my life. I've tried to touch as far as belief could possibly reach. I've yet to find the end of the first word I spoke. Empire. Mine, I've given up to trace through books an echo of a word again, again, again. The mend of where, of who I am. Who even knows what his own voice is? For it ebbs and flows like spring water, and so easily could be confused for a sparrow, for a dove, in the moments after sunrise. And maybe your voice is mine, or mine yours, and all things of the imagination interchangeable, as Williams told us between patients, their griefs entering his own. For how else be the happy genius of a household, or why want only a singular voice anyway, when there are so many species of thought, so many butterflies to follow sunny days? For maybe you haven't heard the news yet, but you don't have to die in your own mind and heart, but have been welcomed into others. Mine, if you need rest. Mine, if this be your last day, as always it is. for we are never midway on life's journey. Dear Dante, dear Issa, needing radishes to point the way. This moment too, ebbing and flowing, gathering David's psalm, for God is sheer beauty, all generous in love, and Rilke's ninth elegy, where we're the most fleeting of all. We who begin where we end, one voice into another, way leading on to way. For where else should we go but where we are going? The two of us gathering whoever will go, me reaching your way, you reaching mine. So I have a new chapbook that came out earlier this year. It's called Generosity for a Later Generation. And so this got me to thinking about how I might want to structure tonight, as if there could be some structure. But the dedication page for this book says, in honor of my genius former students, each one a miracle of existence. So part of what I want to do tonight is dedicate this reading to my genius former students. And so that being said, I'm going to name them, some of them at least. I'm going to go down the list real quick. Listen up. I'm calling roll. Becky, John, Anna, Cheryl, Brian, Liz, Ginger, AJ, Jessica again, Shane, Carol, Janai, May, Barbara, Andy, Tiana, Katie, Malik, Cyrus, Tracy, Joe, Shannon, Joey, Joseph. That's an inside joke. Callie, Kate, Lauren, Jesse, Leela, Sherry, Elizabeth, Julie, Brenna, Tabitha, Mary Nell. And in memory of Gigi and Tina. So I wanted to honor those names tonight. So this got me to thinking about how I began too as a student. And our friend Barry Kitterman some time ago asked me to write a poem that would be part of a collection of 30 poets from Clarksville. So I put myself back in those earliest days of thinking about writing and reading poems, trying to make a self, all that soul making that Keats talks about. So this is called The Day Becoming More of Itself. The expectations that occupied youth, that set my course and shaped my mind, are mostly forgotten now, and for good reason. The storyline, as I imagined it to be, lacked much of the wonder that has come about. No one could have foreseen, much less sought. Somehow, I happened onto solitudes, bringing a tenderness toward oaks that just appeared one day in one place on the earth, at a time appointed a century before I found their ample shade. What role, then, does will play? That's a question I might have entertained when I was 20, yet my answer then would doubtless match what 30 years have taught me. How many hours did I sit by a river? Image of eternity, image of my own absence. No single day distinguishable from another, believing even so, the day becoming more of itself would spill into the one that followed. On and on, through years and years, until my life, impossibly, would suddenly be larger, longer, grander, a timelessness. Has it been? I'm wary of questions now, asked as if the self has reached a place from which to know enough to know what questions should be asked. How incomplete each moment is, how unaware, how bound but what it knows and what it cannot know. Mornings, evenings, spring, fall. I watched a river poem the hours as they drifted past. Others on the way arriving to arrive and live again, and empty one question, offering another. I thought I might read the oldest poem I suppose I have with me. And I don't know what to make of the title. Maybe this is not a really good thing for a title, but it's called I Remain Unconvinced. And I think it's about 22 years old. So I would have been about 30, 31. I remain unconvinced. Friends listening in may find me speaking to the void, a daily habit. For how else know the debt I owe for having been alive? And such an intoxicant, 1,000 windows. I'm fond of saying these words I seek are already posthumous. You on your side, me on mine. But perhaps we're blind and crawl toward touching some middle place. I remain unconvinced that moonlight isn't fragrant. I remain unconvinced that Dickinson's letters weren't meant for me. For now and then, I certainly received them. That first poet who equated blood with ink forgot that one is slow to dry and the other quick to spread beyond its boundaries. And both stain, both blossom, both redeem. Some say we are exiles, wandering toward a place remote and possibly non-existent. But I say there's a word or two we've found together, born from between us, and we are not empty. So another, I have a couple of books coming out next year. One is called Watermark, where I take mostly a five-word phrase from literature, sometimes the Bible, other times from the band U2, and I weave these down the left-hand margin and kind of stitch my thoughts or realign my thoughts through these kind of central phrases of my life. There's one that's quite long, Acts 17:28, for in him we live and move and have our being. So that's the kind of largest poem in the book, the anchor store in the mall, as I say. But the other book is called Strange Land. Also the sort of idea of being a stranger in a strange land. And so I thought I'd read the first poem in that book, as I say, that's coming out next year. Awaiting Instruction. If he doesn't brood over the state of the world, who will? Everyone, of course. Everyone, everywhere, rising in the pre-dawn, assembling prayer book and coffee, arranging tulip bulbs along the walkway, glancing through open doors at sleeping children who don't know yet what they or anyone is capable of doing to themselves, to another, to wedding parties, to sanctuaries, to galleries, to shorebirds and meadows, to gravestones, to tourists strolling a boulevard. Fish flail along the surface of a pond he now remembers from a life he used to call his own. He was going. He was returning. He was being reminded all the time of what one day he would come to remember without knowing why, for what reason, For whose benefit? For what larger purpose, if there is one? Awaiting instruction. That seems to be the mantra he tells himself. He'll know in time. He'll know in full. He'll be convinced of what he doubts the most. He thinks some days of casting off commitments, chores, concerns, casting aside sleeplessness, prayers, discernments, conclusions, questions, casting away all he hopes to reach, who he thinks he might become, prospects, fortunes, achievements. He imagines being a beggar, faceless, along a street, nothing to be or give, nothing to know or want except the herald of an hour falling around him, the glory of its beginning and ending, now beginning, now ending, now beginning again, now continuing, a consecration, a commending, a clarity of what to do when the next soul passes, then doing it. So I was thinking about, as I kind of began with these students, and thinking I could probably do an entire reading with poems that are somehow connected to former students. In fact, I know I have a poem in one of my books dedicated to one of my students, Liz, who was the only student I ever saw reading on campus. So I wrote a poem called Book in Hand. It had to be dedicated to her. So, and then I meet up with her at U2 concerts. So basically, that's what my life is. Poems, students, U2. But there's one of my former students, Jesse. One time I was stuck on a poem, and she was in a coffee shop, and I kind of went to this coffee shop, and I sat down and I asked her, I said, just tell me some memory from your childhood, and just some random memory. And so she told me something, and I said, oh, that's perfect for my poem. So this is one of the watermark poems, and it has the phrase down the left-hand margin, a presence I can feel, which is from the song God Part 2 by U2. Feel like I'm spinning on a wheel, but it always stops beside a name, a presence I can feel. I believe in love. Behind the story being told. A quick glance down through hackberries reveals between the ampersands of limbs and cross-hatched indecisive trunks a green I'd easily miss if not for how its presence seems ordained. A template back behind the world that I can see or know. The same is true in conversation. The words, misshapen, tangled, and then a sun-struck wordlessness beyond. I think I hear some days the intercessions made on our behalf. As numerous as dandelion stems, the earth itself cannot keep track of. Seed heads given to the wind's uplifting. What can each of us do but listen? Allow the other's voice, naive, defenseless, a space, so that behind the story being told of helping turtles cross the road, one can feel even ditch grass brush along one of the side-turned faces, bound for wherever turtles go. Aloof on 4 tentative legs, on an earth so plentiful, it only makes sense to trust what's out ahead. And since I'm on that kind of same theme, I suppose, many of you may know it's the 30th year of U2's Octung Baby being released, and that song won. So one life with each other. That's the watermark phrase in this poem. Not reaching to hold anything. One willow at the field edge. After weeks away, I want to wander toward the shape of its meandering pantomime against the sky, slow in my own motions, as though life, the ruminative feel of it, could be experienced bodily, felt in the soles of the feet, clutched in the back of my legs, in the tightening tendons, in the sway of my arms not reaching to hold anything. With or without days or years to come, I've set my steps toward a grammar too I cannot hear or speak, wind whipped and flung about and shadowing along the ground. Each of the selves I am or think to be adds what he can, a word, a prayer, a question whose asking is the falling sound of leaves, the gape of the hollow, the wing strokes of owls. Other times, I only listen to the unlikeliness of anything or anyone having been, their being sudden and haunting, fluent and silent, like willow limbs shivered to vanishing. And then I want to read maybe one other watermark poem, just as a way to thinking about students, but then also thinking backwards to particular teachers. And so this one's for David Till, one of my favorite teachers. As though each word were an epiphany. And the phrase that I'm using on it is from William Stafford. If you know his poem with Kit, age 7, at the beach. At the end of it, his daughter asked him, "How far could you swim in such a storm, Daddy?" "As far as was needed," I said. And as I talked, I swam. I just love the ending of that. Each word, as though each word were an epiphany, for David Till. As more and more rain fell, it seemed the highest ground would not be high enough. There'd be no view from which to see it all, not safely. The farthest news gave little consolation. I thought, as I have often done, I want to live to understand what meaning is, how much eternity will fit inside a thought. I mean, I've seen it, heard it, and how a teacher talked as though each word were an epiphany, a gratitude for his existence, so that across his face I glimpsed a passing light and his surprise at what had been revealed to him. I always think of creeks, it seems, eddies and sandbars, rocks I skipped, touching down once, twice, pulsing ahead, not reaching the other side, the murky depths I swam with no one present, the fear that something would reach for me and not let go. Even so, I couldn't stop myself. I dove headfirst, clutching deeper through the depths. One of my students, Anna, gave me an idea one time. She said, a person is a person through other people. And so I love that idea. I love that we are who we are, essentially because of other people and the ways our lives interact with theirs. And so, probably not coordinated exactly, but at this moment or thereabouts in North Carolina, one of our other great poets in the country, Al McGinnis is giving a reading tonight as well. And I wrote a poem to Al McGinnis called Concerning the Possibilities That Might Have Been. And Al wrote a response poem to me, and they were published side by side in the Southern Review many years ago. And it's about the sort of larger family that we're all in. So, concerning the possibilities that might have been, to Al McGinnis. 3 more days till spring arrives, and I'm not sure I'll make it. This winter's been as fierce as any I remember. Sub-freezing temps, ice, snow, the roads impassable for days, the gray sky stillness that lingers on. I'm already thinking of the walks I'll take along the fence row, my ritual each spring. Redbuds will be the first to flame against the drab woods line. 5 by my last count, and each one is its own distinctive shape, determined by the trees that nestle close. I suspect the same is true for us. Friends, old and new, influence how we bend ourselves toward the light. And I don't have to tell you how mysterious kinship is for any of us, especially when it just appears from nowhere, like a bloom, like a letter, like a stretch of time in which we see our lives for what they are, just one of countless possibilities that might have been. Yet still, this only one that is. Well, we take what comes and make the best. And yes, I mean that with an emphasis on best. And yes, I mean that with an emphasis on make. For we construct in part the lives we find ourselves within, and that's another mystery. I may have never told you, I'm adopted. So when I read your poems about the child you make a home for, I read as one who knows what that will one day grow to mean for her. The staggering gift of being taken in and loved by strangers, likewise incomplete. Any wholeness will be found together, despite a litany of awkward words and gestures forgiven. And few truths mean as much to me as this one does. There, I've said it. The thing I've never thought or said before, the thing a child like me, become a man, can say at last with some authority. A truth I've learned in part from you. All of us are orphans finding homes. Our family, though, is growing larger, hopeful. We sing together songs and poems and psalms. We dance, we mourn, we whirl before the cosmos. We arrange its stars. And when we say each other's names, we voice another holiness we couldn't know before, now trembling on the wind. So that's for Al McGinnis. I'm going to read another poem out of this chapbook. This is called Studying the Sages. All these years, I've studied the sages, found their joy. Now look at me. I'm destitute. They gave me to thirst, which has led me to grace. When I was 8 or 9, I used to lay my head on moss and stare up through mimosa limbs. No wonder my mind wants to drown in blue sky. What to make of myself? For I'm made of these stems and twigs and leaf bits turning to rot, and these roots plunged deep beside a still water. I don't worry too much as long as somewhere a girl opening a notebook begins to sketch bare trees holding aloft the afternoon's loss of light. One can't predict the water's downhill course, but one can trail along behind the stops and starts and see a tracing out of something deep inside the earth. Thinking about, I think I may have read this poem here at a previous time, but thinking about adoption, thinking about family, thinking about students, thinking about this sort of wider fellowship, as I sometimes refer to it, I probably will always be the kid sitting next to my grandmother, who was technically my adoptive great-grandmother. Her name was Marie Melson. In fact, my first book, the dedication page says, for Starla Story and Eli, and with praise for the life of Marie Melson, 1910 to 2004, second pew, first seat. What I don't say in that is second pew, second seat, that's me. But this is called a shared space in memory of Marie Melson. She was already old from the first I knew her, and though I was a child, I had an oldness in me too, which neither of us saw the use in mentioning, as together we sat in a swing beneath a century-old oak. Her memories, when she spoke them, went back up hollows and logging roads, along fields gone back to woods, and near to springs I could almost taste. As a people, elder and child, our kind, even then, was on the way out. Fewer by few each season, as anything nearing its absence has to settle on being enough, and only itself in the time remaining. Being the last child of 20, she was the last child still here, partway through her 8th decade, with more years still to come. She's gone now, and I'm near middle age, and the oldness she spoke to inside me listens sometimes to how she stared off to a place beyond the fence and went teary-eyed with remembering. We didn't always say anything, but sometimes sat inside a silence, a kind of eternity I think we both understood and felt the presence of, and grew calm in the waiting for, because each in the other had already heard it speaking. And even now, beneath these words, a spring is flowing. I hear it, and she turns to me and smiles and pats the empty space between us to say there's nothing now between us. I want to read, this is a little different poem, I suppose, although it's probably exactly like all the others. Who am I kidding? But to kind of harken back, as I said, it's kind of starting with students and the idea of this generosity for a later generation. And of course, there was generosity for me from a previous generation. And then all the ways in which that has come about in my life. And then I've made these references to U2, so that's going to come in here as well. But also there's a little James Taylor, so that might be okay with some people. I even mentioned a Mellow Yellow, if that helps. But this is called Separate Prayers Becoming a Single Prayer. When I was in college at Austin P, one of my friends was a guy who, his first cousin was the drummer for this band called U2. And he used to give me bootlegs of stuff, so I think about him often. Separate prayers becoming a single prayer. In the late 80s, I was as lost as they come, bedraggled, dressed in hand-me-downs, old T-shirts from Goodwill, and a black trench coat inside which I hid a Mellow Yellow. And I lived on $4 a day, college years, homeless or almost, since soon my parents would divorce. I'd walk 4 blocks to Kelly's Grocery, where after 2 p.m. they marked down unsold chicken breasts to 50 cents, 3 drumsticks for $0.25. Praise God for the Baptist Student Union serving Wednesday lunch for $1.50, and the Wesleyan Foundation on Thursdays if I left class 5 minutes early. My sweet mate's car was in the parking lot, stuffed with his possessions, for he was, in his late 20s, truly homeless. He'd lost his fiancée in a Coast Guard fire, and James Taylor's voice singing, "Just yesterday morning they let me know you were gone," would plunge him into a misty-eyed depression for days. Amy Grant, he told me, took him to his first concert. And I knew all the words to Thy Word and would hum a lamp unto my feet as I hurried to class. But I lost track of him in the years after, though I think of him often and whisper whatever prayer, a light unto my path, might still remain for him. At night, I sometimes wandered out to sit on the center field grass and ask questions of the stars and weep quietly into myself. And other nights, I'd get a call from my friend who cleaned banks in the after hours. He paid cash and shared bootleg tapes of U2 concerts. Larry Mullen Jr. was his first cousin. I confessed that Scarritt, with its one word, rejoice, brought me up out of a miry pit. And I knew what war I'd been enlisted in. And once at his church, I opened my eyes to look around in wonder as a room of people all at once prayed out loud together, their separate prayers becoming a single prayer, joyous and supplicant, if not miraculous. I asked him what a concert was like. He said, "The biggest church service you'll ever see." And I thought that sounded sacrilegious, even blasphemous, until decades later when I stood in a stadium, the first notes of Where the Streets Have No Name beginning, the words of which had been written on a barf bag, grace covering the muck of us. And I trembled and leaped at the same time, trying to turn myself into my own soul. And so many times now, I've watched Bono reciting Psalms 116. What can I give back to God for the blessings you poured out on me? I lift high the cup of salvation. It is a toast to our Father. I will follow through on the promise I made to you. Now hear my heart. And the camera pans toward him from the side at the exact moment the song's intro crescendos. Light baptizing him, and he raises his arms and leaps toward heaven. I survived those years, though some friends didn't. And I've seen dust thrown down onto graves, and I doubt there is ever an easy time for anyone, faith or not. Even if Jesus looks down, even if he shouts, "Wake up, dead man," even if a heart is forever wandering, as mine seems to be? Did I ever reach out and touch the holy flame? Yes, every day. Yet of the things to come, I know no more than anyone does. So many friends I thought I would see again, but didn't. Cold winds, sunny days, beaten and blown, trampled in dust, losing my way. Sometimes I hold fast to a word. I sing its aching refrain. It is light and sound. It is grace, rewriting grief. It is another day, and all the days coming my way, and I leap up into the depths of its song. I will probably close with one more poem. If I can find it here. Yeah. So I mentioned this particular phrase for "in him we live and move and have our being." Just recently in Columbia, Tennessee, the man that is featured in this poem died. But he's a well-known, I suppose, homeless man. But everybody knows him, Melvin. And so he's in this poem. Who we are and might become. For all we've come to know, what have we left behind? Or whom? Or which words? Which part of ourselves only the words can bring into existence? In the beginning of these end of days, how are we to speak to one another when it seems the words to enter others' lives are disappearing? And how else think of him, the man who sits beside a drainage ditch outside the mall, belongings brought along, greeting passing cars, except as a reminder of what, in truth, we would rather not think about, dwell upon, consider? Do we not belong to each other, to the words between us, knitting our souls together? The question of how to live is answered by questions we do not know to ask, bound as we are by what we imagine the words we take into ourselves imagine. And what do the words conceive? And whom what might we become if we could see ourselves as worded, spoken into being, new creations daily, hourly, being born and reborn to bring to clearer focus how His Spirit still might move upon the formlessness of who we are, dividing light from darkness, providing firmaments on which together we might stand. All creation brings forth seed and fruit, word and deed, desire to hear the whisperings of wind and rain, the smallest voice. A man, unbathed, greeting passers-by. What known or unknown reason does he have for sitting at the entrance, a quilt spread out, a shopping cart held in place by his free hand? What words gathered explain his joy, looking straight through our windows, into our eyes, blessing us, it seems, even if we look away? I've heard he's praying, though others claim he speaks a nonsense no one understands. He waves. I wave. We are being in the world together, as this moment now proclaims. And who we are or might become is held forth by a force I can't explain until I can't explain it. I see Him, and all around us we behold becoming light. Thank you.